So my last video was about me composing a hypothetical theme for the Guardians of the Galaxy. In it, I mentioned something that I like to call the superhero chords. And I know that sounds kind of strange. Am I really implying that there's a set of chords that sound kind of superhero-ish? I mean, at that point, we might as well be using the same argument from the Ed Sheeran lawsuit. But trust me, there is a point to this. So if we were in the key of A minor, the most basic version of a superhero chord progression would be an A minor chord, an F chord, and a D chord. Sometimes we add extra stuff like some sort of a dominant chord at the end of that progression to take us back to A, or even sometimes we leave the key of A to be a bit ambiguous. Sometimes it's A minor, sometimes it's A major, or sometimes it's really ambiguous, like some sort of A sus sort of a sound. If you've watched some of the most popular superhero movies, I'm pretty sure you've heard this set of chords. Here are a couple of examples. We have the Avengers theme by Alan Silvestri. We have the Tom Holland MCU Spider-Man theme by Michael Giacchino. The Guardians of the Galaxy theme by Tyler Bates. And so that you don't think that maybe this is just an MCU thing, Flight from the Man of Steel soundtrack by Hans Zimmer also has that chord progression. The grandiose victory theme from Overwatch also has that chord progression. Some sections of You Say Run from My Hero Academia also have that chord progression. And if for some reason you wanted to argue that because he's like a baby Avenger mentored by Tony Stark, the MCU Spider-Man theme kind of had to reflect that, sections of the theme for Sony's PS4 Spider-Man also have that chord progression. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to judge anyone out here, I'm not trying to imply that any of these composers are like ripping each other off or that they're all uninspired or something like that. In fact, in my video that I previously mentioned about composing my own theme for the Guardians of the Galaxy, I use those superhero chords. First of all, I think it's important to mention, why do those chords sound particularly heroic? As I mentioned before, a composer's job has to be matching a specific tone or vibe or what a character is about. In the case of a superhero, well, as the words say, it is a superhero. They are like your traditional hero, just more super, just more heroic, right? And in most traditional stories, the hero ends up being the main character. And you kind of want your like main character and hero character to be heroic. You want them to be the sort of person that comes up to this tense situation but just lifts it up like there's no problem, or even if there is problem, he is struggling, he always keeps a smile at the end, if that reference suits you, and always rises up to the occasion and threats and odds, and usually, hopefully, ends up beating them no matter what they have to sacrifice. If we keep ourselves in the key of A, that feeling is very well represented when going from an A minor chord to a D major chord. You can think of it as being in like the key of A Dorian, or maybe you're just in the key of A minor and you do a bit of modal interchange, but it doesn't really matter because the main point is D is the fourth of A, which means that the A chord might resolve to a D chord. You resolve from like a tense, maybe sad minor chord to a more hopeful and bright major chord. I know those are funky terms and adjectives, but stay with me. It might indeed represent the lift that you feel when the hero selflessly comes to do his thing regardless of the odds. A legendary example would be the Force theme from Star Wars. Sure, George Lucas probably had some idea of what the general vibe of the world and universe of Star Wars was when he did the original trilogy, and probably John Williams had that in mind when he did a theme that represented the Force and not just our main character Luke. But when you have that twin sunset scene, when Luke looks at the horizon and really decides to go on this life journey, a feeling of awe and lift that you get from the G minor chord going into a C major chord is super apparent and noticeable. And of course, we've been talking about going from the A minor to the D major chord, but there was an F chord as well. In the case of superheroes, I think that chord is important because if you start with an A minor chord, going to that F chord really places you in like the key of A natural minor. So when you go to the D major chord, which is a borrowed key from like the Dorian mode or maybe the Mixolydian mode, it really adds an extra brightness and power to that D chord, because not only is there a chromatic movement within the chord, but because it boosts the contrast between being in like a natural minor key, which is usually the sound that we mostly associate when we just hear a minor chord, and then we go to an F chord and it's like, okay, we really are in like a natural minor, but then you get that like heavy lifting moment with the D major chord and you really get that feeling of like, oh hell yeah, no, this is something else. And in the cases where it's either a bit more ambiguous, where you have like an A sus sort of a sound and you're not quite sure if it's major or minor, the F chord helps to reinforce that maybe it is a minor key, so that when you go to the D you get another extra lift. Or if we're talking about a theme where it solidly like starts with an A major chord and then you go to that F major chord, it's again another bit of modal interchange and borrowing chords from other keys, which leads the listener to hear the first major chord and be like, oh, okay, yeah, this sounds heroic, this sounds happy and nice. Then you go to the F, it becomes a bit darker and you're like, oh, okay, that's a bit intriguing. And then again you have the contrast of going to the D chord, like, okay, but no, it's been lift up. Okay, now I feel secure and powerful. And regardless of how much an enormous genius John Williams is, the truth is Star Wars wasn't the first theme to have the sort of lift of going to the 1 minor chord to the 4 major. It's been in themes and songs and compositions and orchestrations throughout the generations, in musical theater, operas, movies, video games, anything you can think of. And since we all get inspired and influenced by culture surrounding us, it is of no surprise that either composers get inspired by other previous composers, or even that they're actively trying to pay homage or get inspired by a previous composer's sound or idea, whether again that's by their own default or by outside pressures. The job of a composer isn't really to just selfishly attribute some sort of riff that he likes into a movie or a TV show or video game or whatever you're trying to accompany. Yeah, in theory, the composer should be figuring something out that really represents the vibe and mood of the movie or whatever else he's accompanying. And even though it can happen that sometimes the composer and director just have like such a good vibe and chemistry that the director just allows them to go ham and do whatever they feel like matches the movie, most of the times it's actually more of a collaborative effort between the director and the composer to end up with something in the movie that matches the director's vision, and sometimes like studio executives and producers when there's too many hands stirring the pot. And hopefully, if there is indeed like some sort of collaborative effort between the composer and the director, both of them end up with pieces of music that they're both satisfied with. But sometimes in like a worst case scenario basis, the composer is just hired to match the vibe and the vision of the director. They talk about this as being a key factor to the process of developing themes and musical ideas to accompany movies, video games, TV shows, that sort of a thing. So with that being said, who knows if any of the previously mentioned composers didn't have like a completely different idea for their scores, but maybe the director was like, hey, maybe you shouldn't use that, maybe you should go for more of a hero theme sort of a sound, or maybe you should go for more of an MCU sort of a sound, or even maybe you should go more like the sort of sound of that movie in specific that we don't want to rip off because we would get sued, but we might want something that's very much like that, so please copy it. Like, can you please just follow the temp music? Otherwise we might just license a song or get someone else to do the job. And in scenarios like that, you are really not left with many options. Now at this point, some of you might be thinking, okay Mark, you've explained that these chords make sense like from an historical purpose because they've been used before. It makes sense because maybe the director sometimes might just be pushy and be like, no, you have to use something like that, you have to get that sort of sound that we heard in another movie or something like that. And who knows, even sometimes those chords might even be the appropriate chords to represent the vibe that we're feeling for that story or characters. So why are we talking about it, and why does it feel like I'm against these chords? Well, first of all, I'm not against these chords in any way, shape, or form, and to be honest, sometimes I even use those chords a little bit too much in my own songs and compositions because I just like that sort of a sound, and when I'm kind of stuck, I might like just go and rely on those chords because they sound good, or like a major chord to a 4 minor chord as a bit of a pet peeve of mine. I feel like it's important that we know how these chords and chord progressions work, so that if we've never tried them before, we know how to implement them, but also that if we use them too much, that we know how not to implement them and how to like switch for other things that match the same mood or vibe. But in the same way that I mentioned that as it being a little bit of a personal problem where I might end up repeating myself creatively when there's a couple of sounds or chord progressions or moods and vibes that just resonate with me and I end up using them a lot, what guarantees us that that doesn't happen to other musicians too? There are already examples examples of situations where there's already a musical vocabulary and language attributed to the vibe, characters, stories of a specific movie or whatever, and then we interject those chords in there in a way to interject this like more epic sounding moment. And if adding those chords to the movie doesn't really match the vibe, then it kind of sounds artificial, and if you're already a fan of the music or the story or even the franchise that you're listening to, you might hear it and be like, this sounds kind of odd. Charles Cornell did a video about this a bunch of years ago, around the time of Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker, where in the trailer they wanted to add this nostalgic vibe to like, oh, this is the end of this trilogy, this might be saying goodbye to Star Wars for a while. They decide to use like pop song chords in Star Wars and other weird examples. When I saw that trailer and heard that music, I immediately got the feeling that, something just wasn't right with that. And then I saw Charles's video and I was like, yes, someone who understands me. I wasn't wrong. I wasn't just hearing things. If you like to, you can go check Charles's video. I'll leave it in the description. But in the case of these superhero chords, when the 2019 Hellboy movie was about to come out, I was super hyped. I've been wanting a proper Hellboy, like true to the comics movie for a while. Not that I didn't like the Guillermo del Toro movies. I actually enjoyed those movies, but they were a different sort of Hellboy story. And even if you're not very familiar with Hellboy, the name Hellboy and the design of the character should scream that no matter what he does, even if he is a hero, using superhero chords might be fine, but it's not really like these regal and heroic superhero chords are the first thing that you think when you think of Hellboy. And to be honest, I don't feel like Smoke on the Water is either, but look what happened in the trailer. It's Smoke on the Water meets superhero chords.
Be my king. We belong together, you and I.
Maybe you enjoy that. Maybe you think it sounds cool. I think it sounds cool. I just feel like it doesn't match the character, doesn't match the vibe of the movie. The same thing happened in the trailer for 007 James Bond No Time to Die. There's this part where I feel like they definitely wanted to get this like action movie, action scene sort of a vibe, and they used those chords. They are well applied there. It's a good way to take your theme, was supposed to be spy-ish, very sensual and mysterious, and turn it into an action scene like that. If you know a little bit of music theory, you know that these superhero chords are kind of in the James Bond theme already. That chromatic movement always ends up being connected to like the root of the chord. It's a minor chord, now it's a minor chord with a flat 6, now it's a minor chord with an actual 6, and it gives it this like suave, jazzy vibe. It's a different vibe than the superhero action scene chords. They're kind of the same chords, it's cool, I just didn't feel personally like it matched the vibe. In the biggest superhero parody of all time, which is Amazon's The Boys show, when we see these parody movies made by the Vought company, their themes and parody music scream of these superhero action scene chords and end up parodying it a little bit, which is important. And no shame to The Boys, I love The Boys, but it ends up diluting the sound that is very very powerful about these chords. You won't just be able to hear them as like cool chords, kind of like what happened with The Lick that Adam Neely popularized. By the way, I have nothing against Adam Neely, and I think the culture that we've gained around the lick of it becoming a meme is actually pretty cool. But the truth is, the lick isn't just a lick that you can throw into a phrase that no one will care. If you are aware of the meme, if you are aware of that culture, you will recognize it as the meme. Which in a way it's kind of cool, because just like the Wilhelm scream, using the Wilhelm scream for the meme that it is, instead of using it like as an actual dramatic scream, in some contexts might make a scene funnier, or add a little bit of a different dimension to the scene that we just couldn't have in that way if it didn't become a meme. It becomes an inside joke, it becomes something that people can relate to. So diluting these sounds and giving them these different contexts isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think we should be aware of it. Before I mentioned superheroes like the Avengers and Spider-Man and Guardians of the Galaxy with having those sets of superhero chords in their themes, and thankfully there are many other superhero movies like Shazam, Captain Marvel, Moon Knight, Doctor Strange, and Batman whose themes don't really have these superhero chords, which helps give us, the consumer, a little bit more variety than just using those chords over and over again. Like I mentioned before, it's not like these chords are evil or bad in their own way, and sometimes they're even used like in a pretty creative way, like the theme for Jack Sparrow in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. I know that Jack Sparrow being the main character of the Pirates movies is something that for some people is a bit debatable, but the truth is, he is main enough to have his own theme. I'm gonna paraphrase Hans Zimmer a little bit, so take it with a grain of salt. He is very suave, he's like out of the ordinary, and we're gonna represent that with the chords and the way that the cello becomes like very vibey and very slidey and kind of offbeat. But at the same time, he's still a pirate, so we're gonna use sequence of notes and parts of the main Pirates theme, but then we're gonna change it and distort it and mold it in a way that it matches Jack's character. Jack Sparrow is a non-traditional hero, and he's definitely not a superhero, but in that context, because it has multiple things going on. It has the vibey cello, it has the slitty slidiness of it, and it also represents the sexy and mysterious character of Jack. Not only does it end up working, but it actually works in a very creative way. In the fight theme of How to Train Your Dragon, there's also a part where we go for these superhero chords. It's not a superhero movie, the characters are not superheroes, but it's also proof that we can use these chords and these sequences for whatever we want to if we are actually aware of how they work, how they make us feel, how they sound, and especially for all these teams that are composing music for trailers and movies and stuff like that. Use those chords like you use any other chords, but at the same time, there are more chords than that, there are more ideas than that. You can make a theme for superheroes without using those chords and without using those cliches, and you can score action scenes and contemporary movies without just quoting these soundtracks all the time. Like I mentioned, I just thought that this was a discussion that might be worth bringing up and talking about, so you guys can leave me what you think in the comment section below. Anywho, enough rambling. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Participate in the discussion, subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this video, and check out some of the other ones. Follow me on social media, do all of that fun stuff, and I'll see you in another one. Cheers!